give a warm welcome to the hosts of the Bride of Alternate Ending.
Hello, ghouls and goblins, and welcome back to Bride of Alternate Ending. I am Brennan Klein, and with me, as always, is my co-host and yours, Tim Brayton. Hi, Tim.
Hi, I am all of your co-hosts, and I'm glad to have you with us.
Yeah, he is your co-host. He just hasn't been on your podcast yet. He's a really lazy co-host.
Exactly. I'm terrible at my job.
I would disagree 95%. The 5% is certain technical things.
We before we hit record, we had a lengthy and at least mildly acrimonious conversation about whether there is such a good thing as a worthwhile film made after the advent of sound. So I believe that is the 5% to which Brennan is currently referring.
Maybe a little bit. If you want to talk to him about, pre-code shorts or something, go ahead. Tim is too busy, but we'll try.
But it is I think a useful thing to mention whether or not sound can be good in cinema, because the movie we have in front of us is extraordinarily about sound in cinema.
I
think
if nothing else, it is about sound.
It is in fact literally. Well, we should introduce it, and then we'll go into the historical nitty-gritty.
Yes, we are starting a brand new month for July. We are going to be covering zombie movies, and our Patreon crew voted for us to talk about 2008's Pontypool. And while this may seem like a super obscure choice, we kind of intentionally populated that list with entirely obscure non-American choices.
I mean, one man's obscure is another man's. This is a zombie film directed by Lucio Fulci, but y'all didn't vote for Zombie 3, so...
No, that's true. I mean,
that was a good choice. Thank you for that. Zombie 3's shit. So,
but yes, we are here to talk about 2008's Pontypool, directed by Bruce McDonald. It is a Canadian and specific. Well, it's set in French Canada. I don't know about the where the money came from, but it's a Canadian joint.
It is indeed, and actually, I just wish to clarify, Pontypool's actually in Ontario.
Is it?
It is.
Okay.
It is true of much of Canada that there are weird, Franco-Anglo place names, and Pontypool certainly would be one of those.
Yeah, okay, I misread something, so thank you for clearing the air there. But yes, it was directed by Bruce McDonald, written by Tony Burgess, based on his novel Pontypool Changes Everything, which is evidently the second of a trilogy.
I would love to understand, unless this is an incredibly free adaptation, how there could be a third story after this one.
Well, we'll talk about the kind of weird, incestuous franchise that is Pontypool, but there is...
It is strange, but yes, we should talk about Pontypool before we talk about where it went.
Yeah, and where it might be going.
Mm-hmm.
There was at least announced there was going to be a direct sequel that was announced as being made in 2019, though I imagine that was one of the many things that was smothered to death by the COVID-19 pandemic, but you never know.
Presumably.
Pontypool is a pandemic-proof movie, probably. This movie could have been made during lockdown.
It absolutely could have, in all of its particulars. It is, I believe... all but 4 scenes are set in the same location. Does that feel correct?
I think...
Certainly, it's in that vicinity, 3 or 4. What were you going to say?
Yeah, I would say, if you're talking about location as in the sound booth / control room, all but 3 or 4 scenes. But if you're talking about rooms contained within a single building, it's all but 1 scene.
Oh, that is correct. No, I was certainly referring to the former, because we don't know. That janitor closet could have been shot in another place. That's the magic of movies.
Uh-huh.
But yes, it is a zombie film set very close to its entirety in a recording studio and control booth for a small radio station in Pontypool, Ontario. And here we find I think it's fair to call him a shock jock. It sort of seems to be implied that he's that kind of, crude, tells it like he thinks it is sort of asshole that people gravitate towards, who has, at some point in his very recent past, been fired or in some other way let go from a more prestigious job doing this in a larger media market. And I think Pontypool is clearly a small little backwater. Right.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, the DJ in question is named Grant Mazzy. He's played by Stephen McHattie, who is the person in this film who you have most likely seen somewhere else.
Yes.
Including he was one of the hobos in Nightmare Alley, the Guillermo del Toro movie.
I saw that he was in Nightmare Alley. I didn't dig so far as to see who he was in Nightmare Alley, but that makes sense.
Yeah, it said hobo number 1, and that might mean he was one of the ones that becomes a geek or not. I don't remember.
Yeah, I'm not sure. But he also, some fun facts about him, is the winner of 2 Genie Awards, and is the ex-husband of Meg Foster. So that's exciting.
Oh, the woman who gets slapped in the face at the end of at the end of Leviathan?
Yes.
What a couple.
He's also actually married to his co-star from this film, Lisa Howell, or Hool, or however that name is pronounced.
Yeah, no, he's got taste in interesting actresses that I approve of. But yeah, so basically this film, it is set more or less entirely within the confines of the recording booth as they're recording this morning show. And it quickly becomes very clear that something horrible is happening in the town of Pontypool. There is what is described as a herd of humans kind of roving about town, biting other people, and causing general mayhem and destruction. And they're getting this information from a variety of eyewitness accounts that are oblique at best.
Yes, their 2 chief sources of information are their roving reporter in the sky, who has helicopter sound effects that he plays while he drives around, and I believe they said his Dodge Dart?
Probably.
Or is it his Dodge Charger?
If someone says a car name, it shoots right out of my other ear as soon as it enters.
It's some very outdated Dodge, is what their roving reporter in the sky is driving. And he's the one who first tells them about this, and then later they get a fragment of a French broadcast that gives very little information, but the information it gives turns out to be useful if you know how to interpret it, which of course initially they don't.
Yes. And interpretation is something that you need to be able to bring to this movie.
Yes.
It is a very heady concept that it's one of those movies that really demands you to solve it, and I would say that's probably not a rewarding process to really dig into it.
I would agree, to such an extent that I have been wondering whether the solution sort of wrecks the movie. I don't think it does. But before we get into that, I think we should talk a little bit about how this movie is going before it starts to ask us to do that work, because I at least was finding this to be just a hell of a good zombie movie for its first hour.
Yes, me too. I think, yeah, so I did peep your Letterboxd score. I did give it half a star higher than you, which I guess is our rule anyway most of the time.
That seems like a pretty consistent rule, yes.
But I think your star rating, or like anyone's star rating for this movie, depends on in what capacity the third act they are able to swallow the flaws and the strengths are something that speaks to them. But the first hour of this movie, I don't see how someone could not be compelled by something in it.
Yeah, unless you are just flat out turned off by horror, in which case you're probably not listening to this podcast. That first hour is a thing of beauty. Even just purely from a technical standpoint, we have here a film with 3 on-screen characters for the vast majority of its running time, 1 location, and it never, ever feels stage-bound. It never, ever feels repetitive. It never feels, like, sluggish. It is just a masterclass in how to navigate one space with a camera crew and make it feel very exciting every time we cut to a new angle.
Yeah, it's inexhaustible, and that is, like you said, largely due to it's due to everything, but I think it also, what really helps is Stephen McHattie's performance. Like, there are moments where you can hear him listening to something where he doesn't know what's going to happen next, but he knows it's going to be horrible, and there are these tiny muscles in his face that are twitching. And I don't know how one does that. But, you know, the magic of acting.
The magic of acting. He is so good for this film on so many levels, not least of which, and I peeped your Letterboxd, so I know that you would agree with this. His voice is so perfect for the role of radio personality who is simultaneously this kind of soothing ASMR baritone, but also a hostile jackass whose whole thing is to try to get you riled up.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I don't know how you do that, but he's doing it, and it's good.
Yeah, there are so many minutely calibrated things about this performance, to the point, or to the degree that, like, you don't want to leave his face. Like, his face is the movie in a lot of different ways. So it's kind of this inexhaustible resource of providing you with what you need from a horror movie.
Exactly. So that's a big part of it. And then sort of the other facet that goes into this movie. So the other two people are the show's technical assistant Laurel Ann, played by Georgina Riley, and the I don't know if she's the producer or if she's the station owner or what. She's at least the producer. Sydney, who is played by Lisa Howell, who again was at some point married Stephen McCaddy. I'm not sure if that was before or after this film. But one of the other things that is like sort of the bread and butter of this film is Sydney is not on the air, but she is on a hot mic. So she's doing like research and fielding phone calls and making decisions about what can and cannot go on the air and talking to him. And we hear their conversation, but we also hear what he's saying that's going out live over the air. So the entire film is sort of, at least for the first hour, is this kind of interplay between we're always hearing two lines of conversation. And as we sort of try to sort them into kind of the tension between those two characters, but then also what he's saying, like we're sort of following his own mental space, basically, where he's saying what he's saying while also absorbing the information she's giving him and then sort of translating that information into what he's saying out into the world.
Yeah, it's both an incredibly impressive kind of technical radio procedural situation, and also, I mean, look, it speaks to the fact that, you know, this movie exists because of audio. It is a movie that visually is doing interesting things, but it is really playing with audio mix and the decisions it's making with that in a very fascinating way.
And in fact, as I assume you encountered as you were doing the research, so this is, as we said, adapted from a novel, but the team adapting it was simultaneously producing this film and a radio drama. And it's not clear to me whether the radio drama was a separate thing or if the radio drama was just like a re-edited version of this film's soundtrack. But there exists in the world a radio drama version of this story, and it very much feels like something for which that is a extremely logical choice.
Absolutely. And you know, this movie is inspired, and especially this first hour, by the War of the Worlds broadcast, the Orson Welles. Yep. But I also read that an original idea for this film was to just have it be a waveform of the sound of his voice for the entire time, and I think that's a fabulously bad idea.
Yeah, the opening minute, 45 seconds maybe, of the film is that, and it went on just long enough for me to be extremely glad when it cut away. So
yeah, I found that moment effective. I
found it effective because they started playing with it at the end.
Yes, I agree. Yeah, I found that moment effective in its entirety, but if it had just been that, it would have been completely a disaster.
Also, both as a radio drama or as a movie about a waveform, there are events in the third act that are visual, like only visual, and therefore I don't know how the hell that would have worked. But
yeah, I am curious about that. So maybe the radio drama does have a slightly altered third act in some way.
It does have a different ending, but not like ending, like last minute ending, not last half hour ending. So I'm not sure.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, I'll have to seek that out. I am curious about diving into the PU, the Pontypool universe.
Exactly.
I'm gonna try to.
And
check
it is
out...
indeed a universe, and we'll have to talk about that. But what were you gonna say?
Oh, I'm gonna try to check out the book too at some point, but it is kind of hard to sniff out.
It is a little bit. I'm definitely gonna try to watch Dreamland, which we will I'm sure have reason to touch on at some point.
Oh, we will have reason to touch on it. I'm totally putting it in the poll for what we do in January when we're doing like sequels and follow-ups.
I love it.
But yeah, we'll talk about that later. Sorry, yeah. So yeah, the first 2 acts of this movie, it is you get little tiny visual glimpses of not really what's happening in Pontypool, but in the ways that it has touched this specific location. That's mostly still in the 3rd act. But you do get there are visiting performers who have been affected by this situation. That's probably the part I like the least, because it's like, here's some Canadians in brownface, and I think it's meant to be deeply embarrassing for him to have on the show. So it's like, I'm not mad about it, but it's like, okay, well, here this is happening.
It's weird because the joke is these uncouth Canadians wearing brownface, but they're on the radio.
Yeah, it's very peculiar. Yeah,
it's very peculiar.
Yeah, Lawrence and the Arabians.
That being said, I did enjoy the horrible, horrible song as a gag, though it's the only gag in this movie. So yeah, it shouldn't be there. Just across the board, bad call.
Yeah, I would say so too. But that is mildly, I wouldn't say redeemed, but there is there's a little girl who starts to be affected, and
the fact that it gets a callback does help, but it didn't have to be that.
Yeah, exactly.
Bit for that callback to have worked.
Exactly. You are right. Like, we could have gotten somebody in here for some reason, and that could have still happened. But I do think that moment is effective.
I agree. I completely agree.
So like I said, you are seeing tiny overspills of the thing that is happening at large, but generally you are just hearing about it. You're hearing about people biting each other and killing each other, and their man in the sunshine copter ends up trapped in a grain silo with a dying person who has been affected by this, and witnessing people outside of this little cat flap in the door and just trying to describe what's happening as his brain is breaking down.
Yep.
But
and there's a moment where they get a call from someone at the BBC who's wants to get in on this news story on the ground level and keeps insisting it has to be about Quebecois terrorists, which I thought was a fun little dig at the BBC, which I assume is some weird Canada versus Britain rivalry that I don't get, but I liked it.
Yeah, probably. But ultimately, this part of the movie is Lucille Bluth. It gets off on being withholding.
Mm-hmm.
And that's so tremendously effective because of the ways that it's affecting the people inside this tiny little bubble.
It's great because the whole thing is limited access to information and trying to piece together, and that is both the plot and the experience of viewing it. And I think it does a really good job at sort of locking us in the headspace of the 3 characters. And they're all 3, I think, giving very good performances, doing a lot to sort of make that come alive. There's a moment where Stephen McHattie hears a specific thing that he doesn't know how to cope with, and just kind of shuts down and starts babbling and pacing, and it's as fraught and uncomfortable as any of the more specifically violent things that happen in this movie. Yes,
exactly. And also there's the added layer of babbling is a symptom of the thing that is happening. So there's also the added dread of, is it happening to him, or has he just been broken by what he has witnessed? Mm-hmm. Or is there a difference between those 2 things?
Right.
And yeah, I don't know. So I found this movie tremendously compelling. It really shook me up and frightened me in a way that a movie hasn't, probably in a couple of years.
I love that.
And I really appreciate the exact thing that it was doing was really calibrated to my sensibilities.
I love that for you. I did not have quite that strong of a reaction. I mean, to me, it was it's a damn good, base under siege zombie movie, and I certainly don't want to say that it's not. I didn't necessarily have that kind of visceral reaction to it, but I so rarely do. I mean, it sounds like you rarely do if this is the most you've been affected by a horror movie in a couple of years at least. I think I certainly admired it more for its technique than for the way it gnarled up my tummy. But there were moments. There are some really, really good moments of tension. Can we start drifting into spoilers a little bit? I don't want to talk about the big twist yet, but there's a scene late in that I would like to talk about.
Okay, I do want to say one last thing about what we were saying, and then yes, so let's do that.
Okay.
Yeah, I think the way it specifically plays into my sensibilities is like zombie movies. I'm not necessarily scared by zombie movies, but the core thing of it, just like the disease viral aspect of a lot of them, is something that like I'm an extreme germaphobe, and that's something that like does impact me a little more. And then the exact method by which this virus is spread, which I think we're not talking about yet, is something that also like kind of gets to the core of who I am. So I think those two things are kind of working in tandem.
And we'll talk about that in a moment, but I did want to just touch on a scene that really did get to me. It's probably the scene that I found the most upsetting and effective in the film. At a certain point, the technical assistant, Laurel Ann, gets sick. And there's basically like a mini act within the end of the second act where she's outside of the booth babbling and repeating words, and a couple specific things that happen. One, so by this point they've been visited by the medical doctor whose clinic is where this all started.
Yeah, Dr. John Mendez.
And he's sort of giving them information that we'll talk about the way in which information is given. But he explains to them that she is sick, but she doesn't know it yet. Like, she's already gone. Mm-hmm. But we still see she's still playing the moment like it's like she's fine. And that's kind of a horrifying beat to me. And then when she actually is sick and she's just kind of like staring at them through the glass, and then eventually it goes like all the way over the top and she starts like racing at the glass and pounding her head into it. But before that, she's basically just kind of like kind of walking into the booth but not getting into it, like just kind of smacking against it like an RPG non-player character who's been badly programmed, who just like keeps smacking into the edge of the play space. And something about that just felt so terribly inhuman in a way that was very distressing to me to see for a character who had been very appealing and like well etched before that.
Yeah, and certainly the most immediately likable character as well in the film.
I would agree. Yeah.
And yeah, that thing of you can see her facilities starting to fail her, but not quick enough. And yeah, well, because that's also, she's an interesting character because she's specifically a veteran of the war in Afghanistan. Mm-hmm. And you can see the way that she kind of basically you can see her brain is partitioned into two parts already. There's the civilian part and then there's the veteran part. And once there are, people outside the door, like banging on the door of the radio station trying to get in, she immediately switches to, we are under siege. She says something like, we have an enemy, sir. Like, she kind of like has that part of her brain that she unlocks and opens back up and steps into. Mm-hmm. And that seems to be the first step into completely having herself crumble, like implode.
Right.
And that's such a good layer, both on the level of script and on the level of performance.
Agreed. Completely agreed. So I'm vibing with this movie at this point. Like, I am 100% in this movie's camp. Scary, interestingly shot. We haven't touched on that. It's not a beautiful movie. It's actually quite ugly, and it's got this kind of like a weird high contrast lighting and very limited color palette, but does a good job of sort of immediately making me feel a little tired. Weirdly.
Yeah. Well, because and you're supposed to be, because this guy's sick of his job already. It's 6 a.m. It's just everything is.
It feels like 6 a.m. The way it has shot, it feels like 6 a.m. like in the dead of Canadian winter, where it's not sunlight till like 10.
Yeah, exactly. And there is a kind of thread throughout of seasonal affective disorder, and he hates the winter, and it makes him feel empty. Mm-hmm. And this movie is very effective at.
Yeah, that's all. I mean, we're talking about how the movie is sound driven, but that is all very much baked into the cinematography, I'd say.
Yeah, no, it is. Well, it's a movie about sound, in a very important way, but it's also not one that slacks on what it's
Right.
showing you.
Yeah, I mean, they made the choice not to have this just be a film about a waveform, and having made that choice, they took that seriously.
Yes, which I'm very glad for. Um, because that is just a radio play. Like I don't need to look at a waveform for 90 minutes. Um, but yeah, so we should get into the third act and the everything of it.
I think we should, because I don't think we're done saying nice things about it, but at a certain point, the movie did go, I would say, off the rails. It sounds like for you it didn't go necessarily off the rails, although
It was
maybe
like
it didn't stay on the rails in the way you would have wanted it to.
I think it was a runaway train. Denzel Washington and Chris Pine managed to stop it just in time, but it was very close to running off the rails for me.
I'm afraid to say that I don't even know that it got off the rails, because like its core competencies are still good.
Yeah, well, like I was implying earlier. I think your mileage with the various good and bad mixture of the third act will kind of ultimately determine how you feel about everything. But there is undeniably a lot of new ideas introduced in the third act, many of which will threaten to buck you off of this movie.
And to be clear, those ideas are seeded. It's not like it is just a random, out of nowhere, this is what the movie is now. It does feel like it's playing fair.
Yes,
And I want to say that before we get into it, because I don't want it to feel like I'm bagging on this movie for its concept, which is, I think, what it's going to sound like. But it does play fair with its idea. It does foreshadow its idea.
Yes.
And tell us what that idea is.
Okay, so, yeah, the concept I like. So it's basically the idea that the way that this kind of zombie virus is spreading is through the English language. There are certain words that are infected, and there is a very opaque explanation of once you begin to understand the meaning of the word that you used, the infected word, it kind of infects your whole being, and you attempt to render it as nonsense by just repeating it over and over again, and that doesn't work. And then you start to repeat, basically like a crude radio signal, repeat every word that's dumped into your consciousness, and that just kind of short circuits your entire brain. And there's a thing that the director has said that I don't think is ever explicitly made clear, but he says that the zombies are trying to bite each other's mouths to try to like get into the mouth of someone else and escape their own. That I don't think is explicitly said.
That did not come through.
Yeah.
In the movie whatsoever. And I think it is worth just reflecting. You have explained the concept. And hearing you explain the concept, I felt the same, what the hell are you talking about, that I felt whilst watching the movie. So the idea of language as a virus, I think, has merit. It's sort of taking very literally the concept of memes. Like,
yes, that's what I was going to say.
We now think, memes are the you put words on a picture and it's funny, haha. But when the word is coined by Richard Dawkins, the evolutionary scientist, he meant for it to be ideas propagate, and ideas that are quote-unquote genetically fit will propagate better. So he's basically trying to suggest in a avowedly metaphorical way that we can think of ideas like genes, and the sort of idea as gene he calls a meme. So that's a thing that I think holds water. The idea that you could in some way encode a virus into language, like it could have that effect.
Yeah, it's a self-replicating idea.
That is about as far as I am willing to follow Pontypool with this concept, is to the level of, well, language as virus is a thing we could do.
Yes. Yes. The point at which, okay, so I think the way that it's affecting infected people, that is something that I can totally get down with, but I think ultimately the character of Dr. John Mendez is a complete wet fart in this movie when he actually arrives. And both the way he explains things and the things he is explaining are extremely questionable.
I have a question.
Okay.
And I don't know if you have an answer to this question. When he shows up, he is our exposition box. Like, that's his function in this story. So he shows up to the station and starts talking. Are we meant to understand what he's talking about? Because the other characters seem to intuitively get where he's at. Because they start saying things like, don't say words. Or like, don't repeat that. Or like, oh no, she's repeating words. And they had picked it up quite a while before I had. Is sort of how I feel.
I think that Dr. John Mendez is put into the movie as an exposition box and completely fails at his job in every single way.
It's literally not until just about the last thing he does, which is to start babbling in Armenian. Or not babbling. I mean, babbling in the classical sense of someone who's so excited that they're talking a mile a minute, not babbling in the zombie sense. Mm-hmm. And that is where he has the breakthrough that it is the English language and not merely language, which is already a concept that I don't know that the movie gets. That feels like a kind of arbitrary cutoff, because it doesn't seem like anything what we do learn about the disease precludes it coming along. Like, we know the word kiss is a word that triggers the virus. Well, why not the word basse? Why can't other languages word for kiss? But setting that aside, him realizing that the virus is English and then starting to yammer in unsubtitled Armenian worked, but no other element of the performance, or not performance, but the characters written did work for me, and that is at the end of his time in the movie, after he should have, in theory, been giving us information. Yeah,
no, because that's the thing. He shows up, and I'm like, okay, cool, we're gonna get some sort of, at least maybe not an explanation, and I didn't need an explanation, but like some sort of like rule set laid down about.
A rule set.
Yeah,
that's a good way of putting it.
Which was what I wanted. And he is so obtuse about presenting information to people. And he's clearly like, oh yes, well, I need to sit down and explain it. But then what he's saying is absolute nonsense in a way that I don't think fits into the kind of theme of nonsense that the movie has.
Well, that's what makes it tough, because the movie's thing is, like, nonsense ends up being, spoiling it all the way. Nonsense is the weapon to beat the zombies. Like, you just start, making these weird, non-associative chains of words. Mm-hmm. And it breaks the virus. But this isn't that. I think the movie thinks it's doing something, again, because the characters in the film seem to figure out what he's talking about, because they start behaving in accord with, like, a set of rules that I don't feel that I've learned at this point by the time they start behaving that way.
Well, see, here's the thing that I feel. I feel that everything pertinent that Dr. John Mendez delivers, which is not a lot, but everything is much more clearly laid out in the French transmission that breaks through earlier in the film.
Right.
So clearly the French police figured it out already. And the message that they submit is like basically like don't talk to your close family members, don't use pet names. That actually lists rules, and it's like, and then don't translate this message into English, which they then had done, and we're like, whoops.
Which I didn't get.
Yeah.
Why they couldn't translate I mean, it sets up the, like, it's only in English thing, but why could the message not be translated into English? Because
yeah, that I'm not sure, but I think it's just the idea of, like, it's a long message, and the more words you say, the more danger there is, theoretically.
I mean, that makes sense. But I also... So there's that question I had about the French transmission. Also, like, the idea that the French have figured it out, there's no way around it. Like, the French have figured it out, but this is the last time we hear about the French Canadians, is when this thing happens. So is the idea, and I approve of it if it is the idea that the Quebecois are such giant assholes that they, like, figured this thing out and were like, well, maybe it'll kill all the English-speaking Canadians, and they just decide to sit back and let that happen?
That might have been the case.
Because if that's the subtext, I'm like, okay, I get that, I buy it. But also,
that works for me. I mean, yeah, this okay. So I think in order to skate through the third act of the movie, you have to have a certain amount of a certain willingness to not attempt to plumb the mysteries of the movie, because I think that it is a very shallow pool. Or I don't think there's an answer. I don't think there's a way to solve the third act of Pontypool that really makes sense. But I think that tonally overall it still won me over, but there are a lot of choices that are being made, and I have one last thing to talk about at the end, but there's a lot of noodly nonsense going on in a full 15-20 minute section.
there for sure is, and like I take your point that the way to get through it is just to sort of not try and figure it out. And I do think as a zombie movie, it continues to be quite good through all of this. Like
that entire element is always good.
There's a point where Sydney and Grant are in a supply closet and they're not talking because like just using language sort of becomes a beacon to the zombies. So they're like scratching on whatever paper they can find with a black felt pen. That's a really tense scene. I really like that scene. Like that's kind of essential zombie type sequence. And then there's a moment where they determine that they can use the station's exterior loudspeaker to sort of serve as a beacon. And Grant records the phrase, is it Sidney Breyer is still alive?
Yeah, Sidney Breyer is alive.
Sidney Breyer is alive. And he records it and they just put it on a loop over and over again. So we hear low in the mix, but like clear, him kind of whispering that phrase over and over again. It's incredibly, incredibly tense. So at the level of it's still worth watching, it's still creepy, it's still good zombie, yes, I think you can definitely write out the movie that way. But I think it's so conceptual and it's so proud of its concepts that it's really hard not to want to figure it out, because it feels like the film is sort of begging you to help figure it out. And I just don't know if you can.
Yeah, I don't know that there's enough there. Okay, what did you think of the kill is kiss sequence? Where he is basically Sidney Breyer starts to develop the babbling symptoms, but he like on the word kill. That's the thing that she keeps repeating over and over and over again, and he kind of diverts it by attaching it to these ideas that aren't connected to kill. He's like, kill is baby, kill is smile, kill is sunshine, kill is kiss. And that draws her back from the brink.
See, I mean, again, like if I accept that that's what the rule is, it's a good scene. It's well played by the actors, but it feels like that's the opposite of the rule, because the French broadcast said don't use terms of endearment, implying to me at least that violent terms are safe to use. And then all of a sudden this scene comes along and says no, that's not the case. So like I'm at that point just confused.
Oh, I actually have an idea about that. Because to me, the thing that I inferred is that words that have a very strong emotional pull are the things that I think eventually like kind of ruined people. It doesn't play out for everyone. It's not consistent because the word that the other guy, that the helicopter guy has is sample or simple. One of them. But I think that words that have the strongest emotional pull are probably most likely to catch at somebody.
And that does track with something that it seems like the film is going to start playing with, which is that Grant's show, which, you know, he's a shock jock, his whole thing is to get people angry so they keep listening. And he even gives us a little, like, you know, the shock jock manifesto, basically, where he talks to Sydney about how, you know, well, my job is to make listener angry so he doesn't turn off, and then he gets so angry he calls his friend, and then his friend's listening and he doesn't turn off. And there's briefly a suggestion that he feels complicit because his job is putting words into the air. Mm-hmm. But the film does nothing with that.
Yeah, they don't get there with that one, unfortunately. Like there's a couple missed opportunities here, and then it's a thing of I don't. I mean, we said I want a set of rules, but I don't need an explanation, and the movie kind of fumbles the ball on that, like giving us exactly too much explanation in a way that doesn't make any sense.
It gives us too much explanation in a way that doesn't make sense, and it also feels like it's more interested in giving us an explanation than giving us the rules. Like, yeah. I think it thinks it's giving us the rules by giving us the explanation, but because the explanation is impenetrable, the rules don't follow.
Yeah, and also the characters are very inconsistent about following the rules, and I think that might be about our intense urge to communicate more than about them failing to follow or more than just like characters being inconsistent. But I was just annoyed because they were like, stop talking, and then they were just continuously talking about how they weren't talking.
Right.
And so, yeah, there are lots of in the effort to find a solution to what's going on, that's the fiddliest bit of this movie.
Yeah. And to me, it was a wall that I could not. I mean, I still give this movie 3.5 stars. And that's very much a 4.5 for the first hour and a 3 or even a 2.5 for the last half hour sort of average. So I liked the movie on balance. I'm glad I saw it. It has a lot of good plays, but I did feel all that fiddliness, as you say. I just couldn't deal with it. Like, it just kept shoving me out of the movie, and I guess maybe I was getting too hung up because they are explaining so much, and there's like so many like weird concepts getting sort of thrown out there, and I wanted to stitch them together, and the movie's not helping me do that. So it really did kind of break for me in that third act.
Yeah, and the method in which it's delivered too. Like Dr. John Mendez, he keeps saying he's going to explain things, and then not really, like speaking really obtusely and speaking around the thing that he's saying, but not in a way that seems intentional. He seems like a mad scientist in a weird way. Like, and that character performance is a little over the top too. Like, there's just, I think all of the problems I have are, if you just sliced him out of the movie completely, kept him off screen, I would have been a lot happier.
I mean, I would have been happier, but I still feel like other parts of the third act aren't working for me, but he is certainly the part that is working the least.
Yeah. And that's the hill you have to summit to conquer Pontypool, and it's something that I at least got to the top. I didn't like plant my flag in there, but I collapsed exhausted, and I was like, well, here we are.
I like that. That's a good image.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm glad I saw the movie. It's doing a ton of things that I think are very cool and good, but I gave up. I did not complete the ascent.
Yeah, no, that's totally fair. And also, did you stick around through the closing credits?
I sure did.
Did you see that wild bit of nonsense at the end, the post-credits scene?
Apparently, that post-credits scene is what inspired Dreamland, the spin-off movie. But that post-credit scene was a different film.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, so it was okay, so, again, we spoiled everything at this point except for the last 10 seconds. But yeah, so essentially it's kind of a Miracle Mile situation. Like, they kiss and they get bombs dropped on them, ultimately. And then credits roll. Over the credits, you hear a bunch of radio broadcasts that imply that this thing is spreading to other towns, even though it was largely just contained to Pontypool. And you do hear that shitty British announcer starting to do it as well.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, so the post-credit sequence, like, it's Sidney Breyer and Grant Mazzy, and they're like in the booth, but there's snow outside the window behind them, and he's dressed as a cowboy, and they call him like Johnny Snake Eyes, and they're like, let's go do some crimes. Or it is purest nonsense.
And it's like, it's initially in this ultra high contrast digital black and white that then like fades to color at a certain point.
Yeah.
And it's all just bizarre, but not in the right way. It's like bizarre in the way of somebody who thinks they like David Lynch, but they don't understand what they like about David Lynch.
Yeah. Truly bizarre. And yes, apparently that inspired the 2019 like follow-up spin-off whatever starring Lisa Houle and Stephen McHattie and directed by the same guy. And I think Tony Burgess, the writer, was there. Like, all of these people are back 11 years later, and it's supposedly like a Western with vampires.
I mean, I'm curious. It caught my attention when I was trying to read about it, and I didn't want to read, of course, the whole plot, but the logline seems bizarre as hell. So,
yeah, it seems like a fascinating choice. But yeah, so that I would not even attempt to try to redeem in any way. It's super weird. But I will say,
the post credit scene is just it's awful. It's just a very strange choice that feels like it belonged to an entirely different concept for this film.
Yeah, did not love that. But I will say the high contrast black and white, that is kind of calling back to an extremely effective moment earlier in the film where they're reading out obituaries, and it's this kind of grotesque linked chain of obituaries. So it's about like, you know, this couple died in each other's arms and at each other's hands, and this person was run over by a truck by this person, who was then devoured by this person, who was briefly missed by her husband before he died. And it's this like horrible, you know, summation of the chaos that's going on in Pontypool, set over these black and white images of the people in question just sitting in these calm Pontypool locations staring at the camera. And that is a really chilling and effective use of that technique.
Yeah, no, I thought that scene was a little overbaked. Like, I think I could have done with a touch less irony, but I did think it was very good overall. I think it was a very, very solid.
Yeah. No, you're right.
And very disturbing, which I think is what it was trying to be.
Yeah, like that moment I feel like is tied in. Like, there are moments in the film where it gets a little big for its britches, and the first two are effective. This being the second one, the first one being the opening shot of the waveform where he's like, you know, Mrs. Hattie's cat is missing, and it's just kind of like a bunch of overspill of language nonsense, but it is actually creepy.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, but then when they try it the third time, that's when it explodes in their face.
I completely agree with that. But, you know, I like movies that try hard. It's better to try and fail than to not try at all and just be, like, boring. Yeah,
and this movie succeeds in so many ways. And that extra half star for me is that it really got under my skin. It really freaked me out for most of it. More than you, but I did fall off of it a bit eventually.
It's fair. And I will also say, I mentioned this actually in my Letterboxd review, but I did have a specific thing that once I like latched onto, sort of deflated it for me more than I think the movie's own merits did. There is a first season episode of Deep Space Nine whose concept is, what if language was a virus, essentially? And it's actually like a real, like, traditionally passing virus, but it manifests in terms of like the loss of language and language becoming this kind of like blithering nonsense, and you can think but you can't communicate. And it's a terrible episode. It's I mean, first seasons of a Star Trek show, never good. There's always lots of really loopy concepts, and it very much feels like Deep Space Nine trying to do like a Star Trek the original series type thing. So when I started thinking about that, I immediately began to cool off, because I was like, okay, you've now reminded me of a really lousy episode of TV, and now I'm not going to stop thinking about that. And that's not on the movie, that's on me. But I mean, these are the weird ways that we interact with media.
Yeah, I mean, yes, that's not the movie's fault. So it's like the thing of, if you as a viewer out there don't have that same hang up, that might not be a problem for you. Mm-hmm. But like, the experience of, I mean, we've talked about this before, the experience of watching a movie is entirely subjective, and that doesn't disqualify you from having that experience.
Right.
And yeah, and I've already said the things that most got under my skin are things that are exactly designed to speak to me.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why it's really effective. It's the same as comedy, like the stuff that really, really, because I think there are movies that's like are more or less not universally scary, but let's say like upwards of 68% of the people or whatever, like is probably where the scariest movies will lie.
I like the precision of 68. I'm
Thank
glad
you.
you said that and not 70.
You know, I've studied this.
Yes.
But yeah, I think ultimately the thing that is at the core of Pontypool is a really strong and visceral and thing that's also really makes a great use of its low budget.
I
Like
agree.
it stretches what it has to the farthest extent.
No, I completely agree. It is as an indie production, it is masterful. And if I were like showing students, for example, here's how you make use of one location and 3 actors, I would force them to sit through all of this because it is a towering piece of production. I
Yes.
think, on a budget.
Yeah, it is phenomenal, and it did really bowl me over in very many ways, but you do have to forgive it some kind of like truly psychedelic nonsense.
Yeah, you know. And I've seen horror movies that shit the bed way harder than this. So.
Oh yeah, because even the worst parts there are tense elements of
That's the
when
thing,
when
like-
you're focusing on the
like-
physical circumstances.
Exactly. If I can turn off the part of my brain trying to figure out why this is happening and how they're getting around it. And that's the other thing. Like, the characters sort of intuit the rules that I haven't intuited, and they just, like, escape these scenarios that I don't understand how they escaped. But the scenarios themselves are very tense, and that's a good thing.
Yeah, and they do up the ante a little bit in the third act. Like you do see them fighting a couple zombies.
Yes.
They got what?
Including the callback to the one who was one of the Lawrence of Arabia's. Or whatever
Yes,
it was called.
yeah, they do kill the little girl, and that's a tense scene, of course. And then they get 12 to 20 extras or so to come in and shout words, which is effective.
Yes.
I don't know. I think I'm tapped out on Pontypool.
I am also tapped out on Pontypool, but if I can redirect our energies just for a couple seconds, because you said something that like latched into my brain. You are 68% of people find certain movies scary. I'm curious, and if you don't have an answer, then don't worry about it. What do you think is the movie most commonly regarded as very scary that doesn't work on you?
It doesn't work on me. Okay, because I think I know your answer.
I'll bet you do. That's what I'm asking, because I have an answer like right at my fingertips.
Okay, you talk about yours while I think about it a little bit.
So mine is absolutely The Exorcist.
Yep. Yeah.
Which I think it's a great piece of cinema. I think it's beautifully acted, very consummately staged. I think you have several excellent scenes, effects that fall into that sweet spot of being not terribly convincing, and yet they are unconvincing in ways that reinforce the sort of weird inhumanity of what's going on. So I greatly admire the film. I think it's really well put together. I bet there aren't 2 shots in that entire movie that actually scare me. And I don't know. I refuse to believe it's simply that I'm not a Catholic, because I know that other non-Catholics find that movie scary, but maybe that's it. I find it admirable and very, very not in my guts. The only part of that movie that gets into my guts at all is Ellen Burstyn, and she's sort of sidelined by the time it actually gets to like the exorcism.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, let me think. I don't know. There's definitely movies that I do not like that are like scary movie classics, but I don't think I would try to rob them of being effective to some people or in some scenes, but I definitely... Shoot, what was the one? I mean, Hereditary, maybe? Like, there are extremely emotionally affective moments, but I wasn't scared by it.
Yeah, I wasn't scared by it, although it's, I think, very hard not to completely be dislodged psychologically when the little girl's head is knocked off.
Oh, no, see, yeah, that part, that's the one I'm talking about, like, primarily.
Yeah.
But,
Yeah.
I mean, that's not a scary scene. It's not supposed to be.
No.
But, like, the third act people found very scary, and I was just like, this is very reminiscent to me of Paranormal Activity 4, and I hate that movie, and this is just making me mad.
Yeah.
I need to come up with a better answer than that, but I got to think about it.
Okay. Well, we'll return to this on a future episode, because I do find it to be an interesting... What scares us is to me a more interesting question than what do we find funny, because I think what we find funny is ultimately just a taste thing. I think what scares us sort of gets into where we live in our brains. So I do find the answer, like, why do I not find this movie scary and other people do? Or why do I find this movie scary and other people don't? Those are questions that I linger on sometimes because I find them just interesting for what they say about how I exist in the world differently than other people might.
Yeah. And to flip it around, if I had to guess the movie that might be most scary to the most people, I think it would be probably something like The Descent, where the first half and the second half are scary in completely different ways. So you're delivering that like extreme underground claustrophobia, which I think will affect a certain subset of people, and then the other subset like the jump scare kind of actiony stuff. And that movie has both, so that might be the thing.
Yeah, and The Descent is a movie that worked on me pretty hard. Actually.
Oh yeah, that was it. It is a more or less perfect movie. Anyway, since we're off topic a little bit, I kind of want to catch up with you on Elvira stuff, because you watched Elvira's Haunted Hills. And
I watched Elvira's Haunted Hills.
And I read the memoir, so we can kind of do a little sequel to last episode.
I'd love that, yes. Elvira's Haunted Hills is fun, but it is not fun in quite as fulsome a way as Elvira, Mistress of the Dark. It is very avowedly and even explicitly a parody of / homage to the AIP Edgar Allan Poe films directed by Roger Corman and starring Vincent Price. And I mean, we know that Cassandra Peterson loves Vincent Price. She tried to get him to be in Mistress of the Dark. So it's a very loving homage parody. But in a weird way, it feels like it is sillier. And I mean, Mistress of the Dark is a plenty silly movie, but like, I guess if I had to draw a distinction, I'd say Mistress of the Dark feels like burlesque and Haunted Hills feels like vaudeville, in that it just feels like it's for a younger audience. Like I would say a 10-year-old could handle the jokes in Haunted Hills, a 9-year-old even. And there are some jokes that are like sex jokes that are potentially going to go over their head, potentially not. And of course there's a ton of boob jokes. But there's no like, I hesitate to use the word sophistication because I don't think Mistress of the Dark is a sophisticated movie. But it has a sensibility that I think requires you to have a better understanding of how adults work. And I don't get that from Haunted Hills. And that was a little bit of a disappointment because it's less bawdy. And I mean, the bawdiness is part of what was so delightful to me about Mistress of the Dark.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and she's just like really using bawdiness as a cudgel to just pound her comedy into you.
And by all means, the Haunted Hills is a bawdy film globally. Like, it is bawdier than many, many movies that come out. It's just much less so in a way that I was like, well, it wasn't giving me the sort of like the jolt of Elvira that I wanted.
Do you think it was focusing too much on the pastiche and not enough on the Elvira
I for sure
character?
do. I for sure do. It felt very Mel Brooksy in that sense. Like it felt like Elvira's Young Frankenstein.
Okay. I was excited to see that Richard O'Brien is in it.
And he is quite good in it. He and Cassandra Peterson are the two people who are giving like definitely good performances.
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely going to check it out at some point reasonably soon.
It's on Amazon Prime. That's how I watched it.
Hell yeah, baby. Like I was telling you, I have a little bit of extra movie time this week, so we'll see what I can squeeze in. But I did read Cassandra Peterson's memoir, which is called Yours Cruelly, Elvira, Memoirs of the Mistress of the Dark. And it is a top to bottom fascinating read. I highly, highly, highly recommend it. But things that are relevant to our discussion of the film. Basically, her major influences as a kid were Jerry Lewis movies, the Carry On British comedies, and Ginger from Gilligan's Island. And I was like, yep, that all makes sense.
That is... You could not possibly dial up 3 more exactly perfect inspirations for that character.
Yeah, so that makes perfect sense. And then the thing that we brought up as kind of a strange, peculiar aspect of the movie was the constant men attempting to assault Elvira and then getting the better of by Elvira. but it turns out like that is a very close mirror to her actual life. That happened to her a lot, and she mostly escaped those situations intact and was fine. But I think it's one of those things where it's like, to her, that is what the world is. And so including that probably didn't seem weird, because she's like, well, this happens all the time. And, you know, you got to have a sense of humor about your life. So that was kind of grim. But then she's done so much. Like the amount, because she became a Las Vegas showgirl at the age of 17, like in the 70s, and she has any major pop culture figure from the late 60s, 70s, and 80s she has encountered in some way. Like she kissed Jimi Hendrix. She went on a double date with Arnold Schwarzenegger before he was in movies. And just the amount of people that she encountered in weird situations she ended up in. She lived in a haunted mansion for a while that was then bought by Brad Pitt.
Yeah.
She witnessed a murder. The things in her life are truly fascinating, and there is no chapter that doesn't have some sort of eye-popping, revealing story about her or the celebrity culture of the time, or just the general culture of the time. It was really, really, really interesting.
All right, good to know.
But yeah, I recommend that to everyone listening. And yeah, we should wrap up this episode.
We should. We've been chatting for a bit, but thank you all for joining us.
Yeah.
I hope you watched Pontypool along with us. It's a fascinating and very worthy object.
Yeah, I highly recommend Pontypool. I'm gonna revisit it. I don't think anything's gonna change about how I feel about it in terms of the complicated part of the story, but I definitely want to kind of dive in again and see if it makes me feel the same way. But next time, we are going to be discussing 1972's Tombs of the Blind Dead, which is it's a Spanish film, right?
It is a Spanish film. I believe it's Spanish-Italian, but it is primarily Spanish.
In Spanish, right?
You could also watch the English dub if you're lame.
Okay, so actually, this is good for me because I haven't watched it yet. Is it... So basically, you know, I always try to watch movies as they were intended to be seen. So like foreign films I watch in the original language with English subtitles. But for the Italian movies, I watch them with the English dub because that's essentially how they were meant to be seen.
I mean, Italian movies, it's just a wild free-for-all what language they were meant to be seen in to a certain extent. I will say this. The longest extant cut of Tombs of the Blind Dead is only in Spanish.
Okay, then that's... Well,
And
longest is a different thing.
If I believe... Well, that's the question. Is longest the correct one? If I'm not mistaken, the recent Blu-ray from Synapse Films includes as a special... Not a special feature, as a way of watching the film, the long cut with English for all the scenes in which it is available, and then subtitled Spanish for the scenes where it is not. Which is also the way that the extended cut of Deep Red has been made available in English.
Interesting. Well, if it has Italian money, but it's like a Spanish language film, should I try to watch it in Spanish? Is what I'm saying.
I think you should watch the longer cut in Spanish. Would be the correct choice to make.
Okay, yeah, because like the only thing I make exceptions for to not watch subtitled is the Italian films, because those were intended to be viewed in whatever language you speak. Yeah, okay, cool. Yeah, so we're doing Tombs of the Blind Dead. If you had questions about that, there you go. We're going to be covering that next time, and until then, you can find more of Tim's reviews and mine and all kinds of podcasts and other beautiful things at alternateending.com. You can find where to follow us and everything else in the show notes, and thanks so much for listening. Bye, everybody.
Bye.